President Trump returning to the White House yesterday following his 9-day overseas trip, his first as commander-in-chief. Mr. Trump winding up the trip at a 2-day summit with the group of 7 world leaders in Italy before saluting our troops stationed in Sicily ahead of the Memorial Day holiday.
And you know, we've been gone for now a long time, everywhere I go, but we have been gone for close to 9 days. This will be 9 days. And I think we hit a home run no matter where we are.
The president today tweeting, just returned from Europe. Trip was a great success for America. Hard work, but big results. Let's bring in Steve Hilton, Fox News contributor and host of the new show, The Next Revolution with Steve Hilton. It debuts at 9 p.m. Eastern next Sunday night right here on the Fox News channel. Steve, congratulations on the new show. We look forward to that, and good to have you this morning.
Great to be with you, Sandra.
All right.
Thank you.
Steve, so let's get right to the president touting this trip as a success. Many of even his biggest critics looking at this trip as a success. He called it a home run, was it?
I think that's pretty much a fair assessment. You opened the show by focusing quite rightly, I think, in terms of the real priorities for our viewers of, you know, the domestic agenda, what's going to happen with the economy and the legislative agenda and healthcare and all that stuff. Now, that seems to be a little bit stuck. Some would say it's a bit of a mess. But actually, when you contrast that with how he's handling foreign policy, international relations, America's security, there's a real contrast there. He's really showing very strong and consistent leadership, not just on this trip, but actually if you go back to the response to Syria's use of chemical weapons, there's a sense of confidence and assurance about how he's handling foreign relations that I think is really striking. And what you saw on this trip, I think, is a really consistent message coming out, which is, number one is America's security. He went to the Middle East and said, right, let's get together and fight ISIS. He put that at the top of the agenda. He then goes to Europe and says the same thing to NATO. Now, the difference is in how those different audiences responded. The allies that we have, the traditional allies in the Gulf and the Arab states and all that, remember the 50 Muslim leaders that he spoke to, they really responded to that new American leadership. Whereas in NATO, this was actually a different message, and they weren't too keen on hearing it. But actually, from the president's point of view, it was the same story, which is putting American security first and America leading an effort to fight terrorism around the world. I thought it was great.
It's such a great point, and he really did start off the trip with a very strong, tough stance on terror. As you mentioned, telling those 50 Gulf leaders, quote, terrorism is a threat, a bad threat to all humanity, and together we will overcome that threat. So are you suggesting that message was received mixed as far as how that message was received abroad and here at home?
I think the mix was not necessarily abroad and home. It's actually the two parts of the trip abroad, if you see it that way. You've got the first part where you have these allies of America who for a long time now, during the Obama years, thought that basically America had abandoned them, was actually much more interested in forging ties with Iran and had really changed fundamentally the position that they had gotten accustomed to, which is America by their side in fighting their threats. And so there was a huge sense of relief that President Trump was going back to the previous strong alliance with those nations and actually enhancing it and saying we're going to go further. But the second part of the trip in Europe, I thought the audience there didn't particularly like what they heard, and there were some rocky moments there. But you know, honestly, I thought that what President Trump said there, particularly in relation to NATO countries stepping up to the mark and putting their money behind the commitment to common defense in Europe, I thought that was perfectly reasonable. Now, they may not like hearing it, and they may not like hearing it very directly from the president, but it's a perfectly fair point. And I thought that, you know, you could have predicted that they wouldn't like hearing it. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that the president shouldn't say it.
Yeah, and a big question now is, as the president has returned to Washington, he's back to work. He's already tweeting this morning, Steve, is whether that momentum will translate and come back here as he gets back to work in Washington. I want to turn back to terror and this Manchester attack because we continue to learn more about the attack and the terrorist. UK police have released the images now, the surveillance images from the arena the night of the attack. We're getting a closer look at this man, 22-year-old Salman Abedi, who is dead. He killed 22 in the arena that night, wounded 120 others. Prime Minister Theresa May urging Britons to remain vigilant in the wake of all this as we learn more about how this attack was played out and the attacker himself. What is the broader message that we begin to take away in the aftermath of that brutal attack, Steve?
I'm afraid to say I don't think it's a particularly reassuring one. Look, the wounds of Manchester, literally are still very present, and the pain and grief in the UK is still there. And of course it's true that the overwhelming part of our anger at what happened should be directed at the person responsible and the movement responsible, the militant Islamist movement that caused this. Of course we should be mainly angry with them. But I think that the British people can save some of their anger, if you like, for their own authorities, because the truth is that in this case, just as we've seen with some of the other attacks we've seen, it turns out that this person was known to the authorities. In fact, it's been reported that his activities were reported to an anti-terror hotline years ago. He was traveling back and forth, it's been reported, with Libya and Syria. There were multiple warnings about this person, and still he slipped through the net. Now, the British security services, kind of unbelievably, in my view, in the last few days, in response to some of the criticism that's been building, have actually leaked the information that right now in the UK there are 23,000 militant Islamist jihadis in the UK, and that they are only able to keep track of about 3,000. They've actually put that information out there. And I just think that is not good enough. Yeah. I think that what this whole thing is telling us is that when you hear politicians say, we're doing everything we can to fight terrorism, that is simply not true.
And we continue to be concerned about what the risk is that we face here at home. And when you raise that point, Steve, about the fact that Abedi was known to authorities there, we've heard this story before with attacks right here at home. How does this change the way we approach our security, and how do we prevent this from happening again? I know that's the big question.
I think that I think here in America, it seems to me that this whole issue has been taken much more seriously for longer. I think particularly in the light of 9/11, where there's a thorough re-examination of how we handle these threats. And so I think that puts America in a stronger position. But also you've got an administration now that seems to me to be really focused on this threat. Mm-hmm. And what you've got is a couple of things. You've got the president putting in place a really strong professional team around him on Homeland Security, and seeing his role not to micromanage them and direct them what to do to achieve political ends, but just to let them get on with the job. And his role is basically to give them support and most importantly, to get them resources. You saw that in the president's budget. More resources so that more of these threats can be tracked and stopped before they actually end up killing people. So I think that they're on the right track with that. And there's one further advantage I think that we have here in America compared to Europe, is that sense of social integration and social cohesion. Yeah. One really striking thing that you saw highlighted again with this Manchester attack, but there's a report on it that was published a few months ago in the UK. There's a huge problem with a lack of integration in many parts of the UK and the rest of Europe, and that is not nearly as bad here in America, thankfully.
All right, we continue to watch that story develop. Steve Hilton, very nice to see you this morning on this holiday morning. And everyone, be sure to watch the debut of The Next Revolution with Steve Hilton. It begins next Sunday, June 4th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Steve, we look forward to it.